Hi everyone, I'm here at the beautiful Dunes Club in Myrtle Beach, and it's always been a great setting for me just to be able to sit and to think and to write. In fact, a good portion of all three of my books were written right here. But I have another story that I'd like to share with you, and I'm afraid it's not an entirely uplifting story, but it's an important one nonetheless. And there's a point to it that I think you'll see. It's about a guy named Frank. Frank was born in Savannah, Georgia. His parents separated when he was just a little boy, and he was raised by his mom, Margie. Frank wasn't a great student, and yet he was always determined. He dropped out of high school to study heavy machine operations in Battle Creek, Michigan. Doing that, he was able to earn his high school equivalency degree from the Job Corps. He found an assembly line job working for Ford in Detroit, but then he had to give that up due to his asthma. So he traveled to Washington, D.C. At the time, he was 24 years old. He found a house in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of D.C. to live in. He worked at a few hotels before finally landing a job as a security guard at one of the big hotels right there on the banks of the Potomac River. In the year that Frank had been working at that hotel, there was only one attempted burglary. In fact, it was considered to be so safe that the security officers in the building only carried a can of mace. Still, he took his responsibility seriously, and he did his job well. One June night, Frank was making his midnight rounds when he noticed a piece of duct tape on the door locks. The tape was placed over the latch bolt to prevent the door from locking shut. So he removed the tape and he continued on his patrol. 30 minutes later, Frank returned and he noticed there was more tape on the same door. He didn't hesitate. He rushed up to the lobby and he telephoned the DC police to come right away. When they arrived, the police turned off all of the elevators and they locked the doors and they began to search the offices one by one. Frank led the way because he knew the hotel better than anybody else did. 5 men were found in one of those offices. And he remembered, when we turned the lights on, one person, then two persons, then three persons came out, and on down the line. The office, the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The place, of course, was the Watergate Hotel. You may have heard about Frank. Frank Wills was his full name. The rest, of course, is history. The arrest that night triggered the Watergate scandal, and the investigation that followed into the break-in exposed a whole trail of cover-ups and abuses that led to the highest levels of the Nixon administration and ultimately to the president himself. 2 years later, President Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974. That would not have happened without Frank Wills doing his job. Frank's log entry made on June 17th, 1972 at 1:47 in the morning is now on display in the National Archives. You can go see it. I'll post a photo of it separately along with a few others. But there's more to Frank's story that you probably haven't heard, and this is what I found to be particularly sad. Frank was hailed as a hero far and wide after the Watergate break-in, and you would have expected him to receive a raise, a big raise, above his $80 per week salary, but that didn't happen. So he quit his job, and given the way that he was treated, you really couldn't blame him for that. But Frank struggled with his sudden celebrity status, and he had real difficulty keeping a job because of all the media opportunities and the appearances that took him away from the work that he did have. But even those jobs were minimum wage. He appeared briefly on the talk show circuit, and if you ever saw the 1976 film All the President's Men, he played himself. Frank shuttled back and forth on I-95 between South Carolina and Washington, and he spent a little time in the Bahamas too. Over the next 20 years, though, Frank struggled. He struggled a lot. He tried to get a security job at Howard University, but he was told on the side that they were afraid they'd lose their federal funding if they hired him. Another security job with Georgetown University didn't last long either. For a brief time, he was even a spokesperson for a diet program, but that didn't work out. In 1979, Frank was convicted of shoplifting, and he was fined $20. And 4 years later, he was convicted of shoplifting a pair of shoes at a store in Augusta, Georgia, that landed him in jail for 1 year. In the mid-1970s, Frank finally settled in North Augusta, South Carolina, to care for his mom, Margie, who had just suffered a stroke. Together, they survived on her $450 monthly Social Security checks. Margie died in 1993, but Frank was so poor that he had to donate her body to medical research because he didn't have any money to bury her. So throughout his life, still, reporters continued to contact Frank on the big anniversaries of the Watergate break-in. And in 1992, the 20th anniversary, reporters asked him, if you're given a chance to do it all over again, would you? Frank looked down and he replied simply, it was just a part of destiny. Everybody tells me that I'm some kind of hero, but I did what I was hired to do, and really all I ever wanted was a chance to move upward in my job. But Frank led a quiet life with his cats, and he spent his time tending to his garden. He even made the local library his office. When he was 52 years old, Frank Wills died in Augusta, Georgia, from a brain tumor. But there's no doubt that Frank played a special role in the history of our nation, and if you believe in fate, he might have even had a preordained purpose. There's an old poem by Robert Frost. It's a favorite of mine that's entitled "Acquainted with the Night," that reminds me of Frank Will's life, even though Frost wrote it long before even he was born. But here it is. I've been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. Then proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been acquainted with the night. So Frank Wills really was the watchman on his beat that night, 46 years ago. He didn't know it at the time, but he was on the nation's beat that night. And by the end of his life, he was fully acquainted with the night. So here's my point. We need men and women like Frank, the watchman on their beat. My own belief, and I think you'll agree, is that we should appreciate their work and acknowledge them for all that they do. And we owe them that. Anyway, there you have it. That's Frank Wills. He was the watchman on his beat, and he did his job. I thought you'd like to know.